Hello, and thanks so much for joining me for another episode of the Coin Stories podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Brunell, and I'm talking to leading voices in Bitcoin and macroeconomics. Please take a moment to subscribe to my page and like this video so other people see it in their feeds and so that you get my alert notifications for new episodes. And just a quick note, this podcast does not provide financial advice. Before I share my next guest, I have these messages from my sponsors who make the Coin Story Show possible. First, this episode is powered by the Bitcoin Conference 2022. It's going to be held in Miami, April 6th through 9th, and it's going to be the biggest Bitcoin event in the world. All 4 days will be jam-packed with exclusive content, exciting announcements, and an incredible lineup of Bitcoin speakers, artists, and leaders. Day 1 is Industry Day for enterprising Bitcoiners who are looking to build a business or career within the ecosystem. Days 2 and 3 are General Conference Days featuring speakers like El Salvador President Nayib Bukele, who has promised a big surprise at the event, as well as CEOs like Michael Saylor, Elizabeth Stark, Jack Mallers, Adam Back, and hundreds more. The conference caps off on the 4th day with the world's first and largest Bitcoin music festival, Sound Money Fest, headlined by rapper and fellow Bitcoiner Logic. You're also going to hear from Steve Aoki, CL, Run the Jewels, deadmau5, and many more. Last year's conference sold out, and this year's is on pace to be 3 times larger. So make sure you grab your tickets before it's too late. Tickets are selling out fast, so make sure to get yours at b.tc/conference and use the code COINSTORIES for 10% off. This episode is also powered by OKCoin, my favorite place to dollar cost average without the crazy fees. OKCoin recently launched its Crypto for All initiative, and it's aimed at democratizing knowledge and access to Bitcoin. OKCoin is one of the fastest growing and most secure global cryptocurrency exchanges that serves all your needs for Bitcoin and is committed to investing in educational content, funding crypto developers and entrepreneurs from underrepresented groups, and helping more diverse talent work on crypto ecosystem projects and careers. OKCoin has actually contributed more than $1 million to Bitcoin core devs and counting, has one of the most active Lightning nodes, and recently launched Sats mode. You can head to go.okcoin.com/Natalie and use my referral link for $10 in Bitcoin when you sign up. I'm so excited to share my guests today are Aleks Svetski and Mark Moss, 2 of my friends and 2 prominent names in the Bitcoin space. They recently joined forces to write the book UnCommunist Manifesto, which they hope will serve as a central text to tackle the struggle between individual sovereignty and collective coercion, which they argue is all around us. Now, they followed the length and the format of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, and they wrote it to remind people to reach upward to become better versions of themselves. This is a phenomenal book. It's a quick read, and I highly recommend you support their Kickstarter to get your copy. There's a link in the description. And without further delay, here are Mark and Aleks. All right, thanks guys so much for joining me. I loved the book, but first of all, for people that maybe aren't super familiar with Communist Manifesto, can you just kind of give a brief summary of that book? Because obviously it was inspired by that piece of writing.
Oh, good. Mark, since you are old enough to have written that book, do you want to go ahead and
I can, well, because I can be a little more concise. You'll talk for the whole time about that. Yeah, a brief overview of the book is that it was written by Karl Marx and Engels, 2 guys. Karl Marx gets most of the credit for that. And it was written at a time about 100 years after the Industrial Revolution. And to me, that's important because if you look back through thousands of years of history, what really changes the world is technology. It changes the way that we organize, we work, communicate. And so it was important that this book was written right after the Industrial Revolution, which was one of the biggest technology revolutions that we've had. And it changed the way the world worked. And it took everybody from decentralized out in like farms and fields and brought people into cities and factories, and it started centralizing people, and it really changed the relationships of families and the way people worked and so forth. And so he wrote this about 100 years after that. I think it's important to understand who he was and the time period he wrote the book. And he basically wrote this book that was a uniting call for communism. So communism was already all over the place. And he wanted to kind of organize and unite people and to get them onto one set of thoughts. So it's 4 chapters. It's about 8,000 words. Most people can read it in about 45 minutes or 60 minutes. And it's just this infectious ideology that just won't go away. I believe Aleks said that it's like the #1 most translated book for economics and political science. And basically it's 4 chapters. It's easy read. And he breaks down all the different types of communism, kind of unites people on that. He says that to summarize communism in one statement would be the abolition of private property. He goes on to say lots of things about the family and how rich people only use families for exploitation, that women are just means of production, kind of things, like crazy things like that. If people read this book, I don't think they would like the ideology as much as they do, which was part of the reason that we wanted to do that. He also framed it up as basically life being a struggle between the rich and the poor, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, as he calls it. And really, it's the struggle of the oppressed and the oppressors. And to think in black and white like that people could only be broken into two camps. You're either rich or you're poor. You're either oppressed or oppressor. It's like, well, how much income do I need to be in the rich? And then if I have that income, I'm in the rich, but does that automatically make me an oppressor? So it's very simple book. And then he goes on to, I think, appeal to people, allows them to be the victim, to play the victim, why they're entitled to other people's things, why they can't seem to get ahead. And then at the end, it's a call to action. And he says, workers of the world, unite, rise up. And so that's an overview of the book. And we wanted to dispute that, but I won't go into that. I guess I'll stop there.
Well, yeah. Well, so let's talk a little bit about what inspired the two of you to get together and write the UnCommunist Manifesto. So maybe Aleks, I'll throw it to you, because both of you, you attend conferences, you have writings and podcasts and radio shows, and you talk about a lot of these bigger picture issues about politics and the intersection of, where sort of finance, politics, technology, society is going. So why did you feel the need to respond to the Communist Manifesto?
It was, me and Mark kind of threw around, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong here, but we sort of threw the idea around, could have been at your conference or just before it or something like that. Like we said, hey, we should write like a short book. I think it was you who came to me and said, like, I just read the Communist Manifesto. It was the dumbest thing I've ever read. And it's like really short.
It was actually when we were in El Salvador in I think August, right. July or August of 21. And I had a copy of it with me.
Yes.
And I had just read it, and I was kind of rereading it. I'm like, have you ever read this thing? So that's where it started.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So it was really a brain fart idea. I don't think, the initial intention for us was to write a book, but we kind of, a lot of the things of the book came spontaneously. So it was the spontaneous Mark having read it, then the spontaneous suggestion. It's like, hey, someone should write a book like rebutting this, and kind of the spontaneous subsequent suggestion of maybe we should do that. And we kind of like left it. And it wasn't until I think it was December or January, just around New Year's, where we're on a call and I said, hey man, let's just do a book sprint, lock ourselves in an Airbnb and let's write this thing. And we weren't sure what we were going to call it originally. We were thinking Capitalist Manifesto, or like the Individualist Manifesto, or the Naturalist Manifesto, and all this stuff. And it was actually during writing it, we went out and had some dinner. We went and had some beef cheek, and Mark Moss's wife, actually, we were kind of throwing around names. She's like, why do you call it the UnCommunist Manifesto? It was just one of those moments where we just looked at each other like, man, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how the name emerged. And it was, I love the process of, we didn't set out with a very specific agenda. It's like, okay, this is exactly what we're going to do. We kind of locked ourselves in the Airbnb. We reread it, and we sat down, and at first, I remember my initial notes were actually specific rebuttals on specific points. And we ended up throwing that out because we're like, okay, well, that's it's not the premise of the book. It's not just about like taking it and reversing each point one by one, but let's adopt maybe the format, because I think one of the things that made the Communist Manifesto so appealing is that it's super short. Like you can read the damn thing in an hour, and like it's the quickest 1 hour version of acquiring a brain aneurysm on the face of the planet. So like we thought maybe we can do a short version and just espouse a more empowering philosophy, because I guess my way of summing the Communist Manifesto up is in saying that it's like an academic justification for individual entropy. Like it gives people an academic reason to be an entitled brat, basically, that someone else is going to give you everything. And if you just categorize yourself as the oppressed, then someone should give you free shit, and you shouldn't have to work for it. Like, it basically sets the stage for that. And our book sets the stage kind of, in the opposite, which is, hey, you need to be a responsible individual and a responsible human being, because if we're not all responsible, sovereign individuals, the world's going to go to hell, which is what we're seeing today, because, these communist doctrines have kind of infected every layer of society. So yeah, it's a very spontaneous book, and I love how it turned out.
Awesome. I love hearing about these book sprints because I hadn't heard about that prior to the Bitcoin space. So thanks for giving us an idea of how this came together. I want to talk about some of the themes in the book because they really resonate with me. Both of you know, I come from an immigrant background. My parents wanted to flee a country that was oppressed by communism, and they sometimes talk to me about how they never imagined that they would see the United States head in the direction that it's heading, because their dream was to come here with the idea of self-determination, the American dream, social mobility, which is a theme in your book. And so the first thing I want to ask you about your writing is, you talk about how, Marx separated society into these two classes essentially. And you say that that's an error, and that could lead to something even worse than feudalism or caste systems or crony capitalism. So talk to me a little bit about the class structure and why you feel that that's, turned into a problem that's even worse than feudalism.
I just want to pick up one point that you mentioned, Nat, about your parents not believing that the US and places like that would end up falling down the same, down the same rabbit hole that the communist states of the past kind of went into. And I've picked up here in the Communist Manifesto, I think it's chapter 2. He's got 10 points. Marx lists out 10 points for, in most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable as a way for them to fix society. And in there is things like the abolition of property in land and application of all rents, abolition of all rights of inheritance, confiscation of property of all immigrants and rebels, centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly, like literally just lays it out. And when you look at places like the US, Australia, Canada, etc., what do they all have in common? Like these state monopolies on banking. Like another one here is the where is it, the progressive taxation, a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. I mean, that is a norm in so-called Western capitalist societies. They're not capitalist. Like the two of the worst parts of the whole communist ethos are literally core tenets of modern democracy, because that's apparently a good idea. And we wonder why everything has creeped towards full-blown communism, is that you've placed society on the wrong slant, and it doesn't matter who's sitting on the slippery slide, they're going to slide in the same direction. And that's kind of the problem we've got with society today. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of throw that in there. I'll throw it back over to Mark to finish his original thought around like dynamic structures, etc.
Yeah. So, the problem is when you start trying to put structure into these, when you have a centrally planned economy, it's who is the person that's centrally planning that? Where do they put those goalposts? How do they define those things? Like I mentioned earlier about like, does my income push me into the rich, or am I still in the poor if there's only two classes there? And so rather than letting things emerge naturally, and that's kind of what Aleks was just talking about, where I think you actually asked in the question, which is the difference of, this cronyism. And so the cronyism is a system where the big businesses use the government, and the government then sets these boundaries and sets these positions. And so that's kind of entrenches their position or protects their position. And it actually, most people think the government will protect them by preventing the big bad business from getting bigger. But really all it does is protect those businesses and allows them to get bigger. And so we kind of break down how that works.
Well, I love one of the charts that you put in there that's under free markets, the free markets chart. And maybe I'll add it to the video so people can see. But basically you guys have like the capitalist meritocracy, and it's super wealthy, upper middle class, emergent workers, broke, poor, young. And these are dynamic classes, right? So can you talk to me a little bit about that? Because at the end of the day, let's say we all adopt the Bitcoin standard, right? That does not mean that we're going to have a completely egalitarian society where everyone is equal and washed out. And I think that, that's a good thing, right? You guys both posit that that's a good thing because you have to work. I mean, we all have different skill sets, motivations, and that's what sort of determines these class structures. And so can you talk about sort of what you envision under the Bitcoin standard and why inequality, there should be, equal access to maybe opportunity, and that would be provided in a Bitcoin world, but we don't want a completely equal society, right?
Yeah, even further, like even equal access to opportunity is actually a fantasy. It's never going to happen. The problem is we're all born to different parents at different times, in different environments, in different communities, with different genetics.
Yep.
Like, unless we standardize everything, there's not even going to be equal access to opportunity. So like, equality of outcome is completely moronic. Equality of opportunity is a fantasy. The only thing we can do is play by the same rules in the game of society, and the game of society is the game of economics, right? So human action. So that's the piece that Bitcoin fixes. So what it does is like, man, some of us may just be born to broke ass parents, unfortunately. Like, I know I was, I think Mark maybe similar, you yourself, like, so like we weren't born into so-called privilege. Now, the thing that we get though out of being born at that layer or at that level of the societal strata is that, generally speaking, we have something to prove when we're young. We're more driven, we're more hungry. And hunger is something that the people who are born into a rich family, for example, they don't necessarily have, because they have a, they're more likely to be tainted with entitlement, for example, as part of their persona. So at every level, there is a pro and a con. And this is something that, leftists and communists and, simpletons basically seem to miss. And I guess what we try to put forward in here is that a functional society is one in which people can actually rise through merit and fall through mistake. And if you don't have that, and this is sort of where there's this big fallacy of, the world today is like we've somehow, transcended feudalism, when in fact we've got even dumber versions of feudalism, in that you have the representatives who run the, who basically are the ultimate capital allocators, right? So they take everyone's money and then they decide where to allocate it. These monkeys get to play a game of heads I win and tails you lose, which is no matter what decision they make, they get the upper hand, they make the money, and if they fuck it all up, they socialize all the losses onto everyone else. And the result of that is actually static classes where you actually can't climb. This is sort of like contrary even to that point, I guess, is that because the force of innovation and the force of capitalism and the force of value creation is so powerful, even with a rigged game, somehow some people are still able to rise up, even when the game is rigged. And that just is testament to how much, how much value can come out of productivity and competence, right? Now, imagine if you remove this bureaucratic socialization of losses and concentration and privatization of gains. What happens in a world where everyone can climb, where everyone is on the same monetary standard? You completely transform society in a way that I don't think anybody can even envision or begin to comprehend. So that's kind of, for us, a big piece, is that you don't want to remove classes and you don't want to remove strata from society. That is perfectly normal. Everyone's different, and everyone at different layers will have different motivations and different, desires and different skills, parts of their personality, their skills, etc. But you want to make it dynamic so that you want to make the layers permeable. And the only way to make the layers permeable is by making all behavior, action, politics accountable to an economic standard that is incorruptible. And that's what Bitcoin is. And that's why Bitcoin makes such a structure possible.
To add on to that, just quickly, I would say it's the fairness of the rules. So everybody plays by the same set of rules, because this equal opportunity or equal outcome is ridiculous in a sense because of what he said, right? Motivations and desires. So I have friends that would be happy just to go be a bum on the beach and fish every day and just surf, and they're happy with that. And then you have the people that want to be Jeff Bezos and they want to work 80 hours a week in tech. Why does the guy that wants to live on the beach and surf and fish every day have to go work 80 hours to be like Bezos? Why should he have, if you reversed it? No, you have to go work 80 hours. You can't just go live on the beach, right? So we have these different things. And then I think nobody's mad that LeBron James is so good at basketball and he's paid so much at basketball. But people get mad at rich people like Jeff Bezos. And I think the difference is you understand that the game of basketball, everybody plays by the same set of rules. You might have a little guy like Steph Curry, he's very short. So he has to learn to play the game differently than a tall guy like LeBron James would. But they both play by the same rules. They just approach it differently. But they see that the financial system is rigged and that people are getting ahead because of these favors, because of their status, because of their proximity to the money printer, et cetera. And so I think if you have equal rules, nobody's mad that I can't play basketball as good as LeBron James. I wasn't born to the same parents. I didn't practice as much as he did, and that's fine. And I think as long as we had those fair set of rules, I think people would be okay with being in different areas of life.
Yeah, one of the things I find interesting about what you both speak on in the Bitcoin space in general is the society that we've created also has no consequences, right? So you can become entitled and you can become a victim and you're almost rewarded for it at this point. And politically, you can ascend because you kind of highlight the victimhood in society. And so I just want to talk to you guys about that because in the Bitcoin Standard, which is one of my favorite books, I know Saifedean talked about this idea of the breakdown of the family, and you guys touched on it as well. And I love the part of the book where you guys envision, this reordering of like family structure based on like security and love and education and belonging and all of that. So can you talk a little bit about like the breakdown of family because of these sort of communist ideals that are permeating society and how Bitcoin might address that?
Yeah, I might touch on consequence quickly, and then I'll throw the family piece to you, Mark. But yeah, I think, Nat, you and I connected over that initially at the Kansas conference, where I kind of blurted out, I think Bitcoin's most important impact on society and on humanity is going to be the reintroduction of economic consequence. And I still stand by that when I think about it. And it's funny, there was Simon Dixon put a tweet out yesterday, and he's like, in one word, can you describe Bitcoin and what it means? And like, I thought for a second, I was like, it's consequence. Simple as that, because that's like life is about the consequences from human action. That's simple as that. And it's the consequence from an action that enables an individual to determine which action to take. And consequences can be positive or negative. It doesn't matter. And for me, like if I had to really distill everything down, it's like in a world that is economic in nature, certain action and certain behavior delivers certain results, and other action and behavior delivers poor results. And in fact, this is, I think there's a whole thread here around like how morality emerges, because morality, at least in my mind, seems to be that which is most in accordance with like the preservation and continuation of life. So, but anyway, that's a whole that's a bigger rabbit hole, which we can explore another time. But to bring it back to the idea of consequences, that politics attempts to mask consequence. Like that's what it exists. It's an ass covering process that plays this game of responsibility hot potato. It's like, let's just throw the responsibility onto someone else, and who gives a shit? Some idiots are going to end up paying it, but it ain't going to be me. And that's kind of what the incentive is when we structure the world around political standards, which are malleable. And this is, again, for me, why Bitcoin is so powerful, is that it's not malleable. That's the whole point. Like, and this is what separates Bitcoin from shitcoin, what separates Bitcoin from fiat, what separates Bitcoin from politics, what separates Bitcoin from all of this stuff, is that we finally have an economic standard. And this ties into part of the book where we've kind of got this spectrum where we say, all right, everyone's arguing about politics and left and right and all that sort of stuff. we trump that. We're swinging the pendulum away from politics altogether and into the realm of economics, which is a realm in which human action and behavior dictate consequences, not some modality of politics that you've made up in your head. And if you close your eyes hard enough and imagine that everyone's going to have the right to housing, it's going to fucking happen. No, motherfucker, that's not going to happen. So that's kind of, I think, what Bitcoin kind of does. It's like, there is no rewind button. There is no, like, go and get all of your Bitcoin. Like, I encourage everyone to do this. Go and get all your Bitcoin and, move it from one wallet to another. Like, you'll start sweating straight away. Like, you'll start thinking about, shit, have I forgot the numbers right? Like, so it's like, it's this beautiful thing that actually represents reality. It's the same as jumping off a cliff. You're going to be double checking, triple checking your parachute, whatever line you've got, like, to protect you. But in the economic, in the political world, you don't have that proximity to reality. You don't have that proximity to consequence. So you just go ahead and do whatever the fuck you want to do, irrespective of the potential consequences. So I just think, thank you for bringing that point up, because for me, that's just extraordinarily important and just underappreciated in Bitcoin. Everyone talks about freedom, this, that. It's just kind of like the same tropes over and over again. I think this is a more important element.
Yeah. Before we get back to the family, I do want to ask though, like, do you think that we got to this place in society where we have so much of this like victim mentality or entitlement or feeling like we're owed something because of that whole, the mantra of strong men created like weak men, or like the weak men are basically coming out now from a generation that actually had to suffer and struggle and build what they built, and now we're just like not strong enough for the consequences.
Correct. Well, that's a function of covering the cost of decision. And that's what happens when you're born in entitlement. And mind you, it will probably happen on a Bitcoin standard as well, but it'll happen in a way where the amplitude is much smaller. It's contracted because right now, if you are born into so-called privilege, let's say you're born in, let's say you're, Justin Trudeau, who was born to a political family already. It didn't matter what he did. He grew up in a world in which none of his decisions had any consequence anyway. So then he projects that forward into how he operates an entire country. So they're completely fucking oblivious. So on a Bitcoin standard, at least, the feedback loop is much faster. And in fact, I would argue that the more time that goes past, the faster and faster that feedback loop becomes, to the point where, and I have a whole thesis about this, is that, we're going to see the rise of a new natural elite. I call it Homo Bitcoinicus, is this sort of these people who grow up generation after generation, operating more in line with economic consequence, and thus we bake morality into our DNA over time. Now, I think that's going to happen, for our children's children, probably, so we won't be alive to see it. But I honestly think that Bitcoin will force, through an organic emergent process, human beings to evolve into something more majestic than we are today. But anyway, that's another podcast. So.
All right, Mark, I don't know if you want to weigh in, but I do also want to touch on just the idea of, how does communism break down the family structure, and how do you address that sort of in your book, and what's the hope under Bitcoin?
Yeah. So again, going back to understanding who Marx was when he wrote this, I think it's important to get his worldview. So Marx came from a well-to-do family. I believe both his parents were attorneys, and they wanted him to go be an attorney and be a socialite or whatever at the time. And he wanted to write philosophy. And the world didn't value philosophy back then. Today, you can do that on Medium or Substack, and you could probably get some sponsors. You could do that. But back then you couldn't. And so he was really mad at the world that he couldn't just write philosophy and get paid. And then he had a family and he had kids, and he was a horrible father. He would disappear for weeks or even months on end. I believe one or more of his kids died of just malnutrition, of neglect. And I think understanding that worldview of a family probably helps to kind of understand why he wrote what he did. But he said that he looked at the rich people, the bourgeoisie, and said that they, their wives are common property. So we should just make all women common property. Have most women read that? Because they're okay with that. And actually in Russia, they did that, right?
He didn't exactly say the bourgeoisies were common property. He said that they were treated as property and disrespected. So why don't we just bring it out in the open and just make them common property anyway?
Right. Which is
even worse.
In the 1900s in Russia, they did that. And he looked at the kids, which I'm guessing at the time, again, remember they, on a farm, everybody works together as a family. My dad grew up on a farm in Iowa, and the whole family is out there trying to bring the harvest in. And my dad would tell me that even my grandfather would loan him out to other farms to help. That's just what people did, right? Mm-hmm. And then imagine moving from that farm culture and then into the factories. I would imagine the whole family probably came and worked in the factory as well. So probably the kids were as well. And remember, this was all very new. And so we hadn't got these child, workers laws and things like that. And so he also looked at these kids being exploited, or what he called exploited. And they said, they only have these kids in order to exploit them and so forth. So I think that's his worldview. And it's only continued, but he wants to break down the nuclear family. And of course, today we see all throughout, BLMs and so forth, they say they're trained Marxists and they want to break down the nuclear family. And we kind of said that, no, we believe the nuclear family is important. And the reason why the nuclear family is important is that as much as some people in the media want to tell you today that there's no such thing as sexes, or there's 50 different sexes or whatever, there's males and there's females, and neither one is better or worse. We're both great because we're different, and we both complement each other differently. And the family unit, having a mother and a father, and having kids, and having that hierarchy gives the kids everything they need. It gives you both sides, as well as it gives you a support structure. And when you have a support structure, so if we look at like this mass formation psychosis that we went through, it was from not being connected to people, having no sense of purpose. And so when you have that family unit, you're connected and you have a sense of purpose. You're getting what you need from your mother, the care, the loving from the mother. You're getting the hard work ethic from the father, etc. And no matter what happens in life, knowing you have that support structure is important. Now, part of the reason why they want to break that down today is they don't want you to have that support structure. They want you to be 100% dependent on the state. And if you look at today, now Marxism has evolved into a bunch of different ways. We didn't really talk about it in the book, but this like cultural Marxism that we see really permeating society today. Part of the reason why they want to teach these kids in school these crazy whacked out stuff is so that they go home to their parents and say, I think I'm cis binary, whatever, right? And the dad's like, or the parents like, what? Like, no, that's not how it works. And then they say, you don't understand me. Right. And they start getting that tension between the kids and the parents. And so they're really trying to drive that apart. And so we did write a whole section in that book where we talk about how the importance of that nuclear family. So I don't know if that answers it well.
No, I love it. And I really recommend that everybody reads that, because you're absolutely right. And it makes me sad when I think about, especially my generation, like millennials and younger, the people that I'm teaching in college. It's like, there's this feeling that because you can't plan for the future, probably financially, or everyone, like all the narratives out there, it's like the climate's going to destroy the world. Everything's so dismal. There's no hope. And so how could you plan for a family? Right. And then on top of that, it's all these issues where it's like, people don't feel comfortable with their identities, or they're questioning everything so young, instead of just like living and contributing and experiencing and growing and gaining skills to be like a member of society that, helps us progress as humanity. And I don't know, it's crazy to see it. Cause like I said before, my parents are sometimes shocked by what they witness happening in the United States. And they never imagined it, because they came from something that was so oppressive and so controlled and dictated by the state. And now actually Poland has sort of emerged out of that and is like on the polar opposite side of where America's heading. So, but anyway, just to start to wrap up, obviously property rights are really central and important to both capitalism and Bitcoin. So I just wanted to ask, in the Communist Manifesto, obviously Marx wants to abolish property rights. Can you touch on just like, why you wanted to write extensively about the idea of how fundamental property rights are to freedom and to capitalism and to Bitcoin?
Yeah, I'll hit this one really quickly. So property rights, like I would extend that the only form of rights that exist are property rights. Like human rights are a complete scam. There's no such thing as human rights. They don't exist. They're just something created by progressives in order to confuse people away from private property rights. Like the only thing you have, and this is where, like, we don't go super deep in this book, but like I wrote a whole article about like how, human rights are a scam, in Bitcoin is not democratic. But it's really important to have an understanding of two things. What one is that a right is something that generally, or not generally, but has to be counterbalanced with a responsibility. And when that right is something other than a acquired or earned property right, then by definition, it is somebody else's responsibility. So if I have a right to housing, for example, then that is someone else's responsibility to provide that housing. And if it's that person's responsibility, then it's his actual anti-right. So like rights are a big, like, a big mess, first and foremost, that people kind of need to stop for a moment and think a little bit deeper on, which once again is probably beyond the scope of just having a discussion about now. But coming back to property rights and like really thinking about what they represent, it's like they start with property rights start with yourself. Basically, you are your first and most important piece of property. Your thoughts, your ideas, your very being is your property. And then what you blend your being with is also, your property. And without that, we basically have no boundaries in the world. And boundaries are extraordinarily important in order for there to be some sort of interaction amongst entities. Because if we are all one and we're all, in this together and we're all in the same boat, and it's like one big miasmic sort of like gray goo of sludge, then nobody's accountable. There is no responsibility. There's no diversity. There's no dynamism. There's nothing. There's just like gray goo. So private property rights are extraordinarily important. Like they're central to humanity. And the last thing I'll quickly touch on with this is that they're the only form of right that can actually be traced back to a biological imperative. There was a book written in the 1960s by an anthropologist called Robert Ardrey. It's called The Territorial Imperative. And this is a phenomenal book because he was like the last great anthropologist. I kind of like place him in the category of like Austrian economic stinkers. Like I call it sound anthropology because he makes a straight up, entire book case for species and mammals of our type who are more social in nature are territorially bound. Like we have a territorial imperative that is biologic in nature. And for human beings, that territorial imperative manifests as private property rights. So there's a whole topic to sort of discuss there, but I would encourage people to read Robert Ardrey's book. He's got 3 books. I think it's African Genesis, The Territorial Imperative, and something else. But this is like, it's central to human existence, and it is the most central building block for a functional society that has diverse individuals who operate on an intersubjective realm. And what that means is like we're all different and we all want different things, and in order to have different things and to each individually prosper and pursue what we want, we need to have a mechanism for creating boundaries around that which is ours so that we can trade it with others. And that's essentially what private property rights is. And like if you don't have that, you don't have society of any kind. You just have this gray goo, which is what the more like the the malevolent communists want, because if everyone's gray goo, then they control everything. And what the idiot, non-malevolent, but useful idiot kind of communists don't understand is that they think, oh, it's all okay that we abolish all hierarchy and that we're all the same. Like, no, you idiot. Power will always fill the vacuum in some way, shape, or form. So anyway,
I would just add on to that quickly, back to the private property rights, is that again, looking back at the time that this book was written. So at the time when the Industrial Revolution was just happening, Marx wrote in the book that the proletariat, the poor, the oppressed, have no private property. They have nothing to offer but their labor, and their labor never turns into property. Their labor isn't enough to get them into this, this rich private property owner. And so we also kind of break that down and say, well, you have more. Private property is more than a house or a piece of land or a car. Private property is your own body, right? It starts with your mind. So your thoughts is your private property. Your intellectual capital is your private property. Now, back then, you didn't have really intellectual property. There was no IP. But today we live in an information age, an information society. And so we can see, like, for example, your career is all based off of your intellectual property, right? And so I think we expanded that definition, and hopefully that's helpful. A lot of, again, this book was written almost about 175 years ago. So now we have the benefit of hindsight to see how wrong it was. And so I think that's another reason why people should take another look at this and read the book that we have. But yeah, we expanded on private property. Everybody has something to offer. And if they learn to kind of value what they have, respect it, they could probably grow it from there.
Love it. Well, the last thing I want to touch on, and again, fantastic book, I hope everybody reads it, is just this idea of the debauchery of capitalism. Capitalism, I feel like, has been weaponized by some politicians as this sort of terrible word, right? That it represents greed and inequality. And actually capitalism, it's the accumulation of savings. It is accumulation of the capital for production. And I just want to talk to you guys about just, can you share why capitalism is actually a good thing? Why it fosters more opportunity for people, why it allows society to progress, why it allows people to move through the social classes, and why today we don't have capitalism, even though people like to blame some of our problems on capitalism, greed. It's actually the crony capitalism that's the bigger issue with our society.
Mark, I want to let you talk about capitalism as a system. I'm just going to talk about it really briefly as the metaphysical idea of capitalism. Is that sure. If we simply define capital as like the three core ingredients of existence, so time, energy, and matter, capitalism is merely the process of transforming them into something of higher order and greater value. That's effectively what all living organisms do, is that they attempt to increase their energetic carrying capacity by taking what they have access to and transforming it into something of higher order. So it's like an anti-entropic force. And that is literally, like, if I was to define life is anti-entropy. It's the only thing that we know of that moves in the opposite direction to entropy somehow. And that's effectively what capitalism is. So to me, like, one of the things that I want people to take away from this book is that don't think of capitalism as some political system, because it's not. Capitalism is a process that has existed from the beginning of time. Like, since the first time our ape ancestors realized that throwing a rock at an animal was a more efficient way to acquire food. Like that was capitalism in action. It was like, hey, I can do that. Like, capitalism was the creation of stone tools. Like, it was the process of taking, the capital that you have and using it to, extract energy better, or to save time, etc. So that's what it is. And like, and in the book, we make the point that capitalism exists in communism as well, because it's called the black market, and it's how people feed themselves. Like, so it's not like you never actually get rid of capitalism, but you can suffocate it to the degree that society actually breaks down and implodes in on itself. And so that's kind of one pillar. And then I'll throw it over to Mark to kind of talk about how, like, I think there is a modality for capitalism as a system, but it requires these 10 points that we discussed, etc. But anyway, I'll throw it over to you, Mark, to kind of illuminate that.
Yeah, one thing I would say is that he's right. It's this emergent order, and so since the beginning of time, as humans, we're always trying to do things easier and faster. And capitalism, and this is something that we actually struggled with. myself personally, I've been kind of starting to move away from that word and starting to use the word free markets more, because everyone has this negative connotation of what capitalism is. And Aleks and I, we talked about it, and he's like, no, let's dig in. Let's show what this word really is. And so we did. And one of the a couple things that we discussed and we kind of found through discovery was that, there's a lot of core pieces of what makes capitalism. So for example, voluntary exchange. So imagine the first couple people alive in the world, right? Like, I just killed this animal and you have a fire. Hey, how about you let me cook my stuff on your fire and I share my food with you, right? And that's like capitalism. That's voluntary exchange. And what happens is when you start removing some of what makes capitalism what it is, then you can start saying, well, capitalism led to colonialism, or capitalism was slavery, right? If all I care about is capital, then that leads to me being very greedy. And next thing I want to put you into slavery. That's capitalism. But how can it be slavery if part of capitalism is voluntary exchange? Because slaves aren't voluntarily exchanging, right? And so only by stripping pieces out can you then try to distort that word. And so we did take the time to kind of write down what all the characteristics were of capitalism and kind of put it into this matrix. And so you can kind of start to see where cronyism or conservatism or colonialism starts to deviate. But again, only by taking out some of those key characteristics. And so I guess we'll make capitalism great again.
I love it. By the way, did you guys ever see that article where it was a newspaper clipping and an economics teacher that basically was teaching communism? And so he created this grading system where, you could study really hard, but essentially everything would be averaged out. And so everyone was getting C's, and by the end, no one was studying and everyone was getting F's. Or I don't know if you guys saw that, but
I've got that story in one of my articles. I don't know if it's a real story, if it was just a fable, but it's a beautiful example of like, what happens when you basically reward mediocrity is you end up getting the tyranny of the lowest common denominator.
That's right. Well, one of the things I love about the Bitcoin space is I love this idea that freedom is actually a good word, and the idea of meritocracy. So thank you guys so much. Where can people get your book, and any final thoughts?
Yeah, uncommunist.com. We actually got, I can't believe that domain was available. we checked it, we're like, what?
Yeah.
So yeah. Pick that up. So get in there. We're actually doing a Kickstarter. So by the time I think people watch this episode, there'll be a Kickstarter live. And the benefits of jumping on a Kickstarter is, number one, is like the book, the Audible version, etc., is all going to be like at a discounted price. There'll be some limited edition hardcover books that'll be signed by me and Mark. There'll be an opportunity for people to actually come in and do a podcast and a live with me and Mark. So there's a whole lot of perks in there. So we want to get this book out as far and wide as possible and get the support of the community. So we're not actually going to go to a publisher to publish this. We're going to publish this ourselves. And yeah, like it's the perfect time to basically buy yourself a 10-pack super cheap, so that you can give out to friends and family, because it's that kind of book. Like, it's a super short read. It really challenged them on the platitudes and vagaries that are being, spewed out by talking heads on TV and on social media. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah. And then one more benefit as well, if you get in the Kickstarter, is that we have a few hours, or we've done a bunch of videos of discussion of us actually discussing this. And why did we do it this way? Why do we do it this way? What does this really mean? What are the pros, cons, et cetera? And so there's a members area where you can get access to all that video discussion, which I think is super beneficial. So yeah, uncommunist.com, that's the way to find it. You'll get access to the Kickstarter that way as well. And like Aleks said, like our goal is to try to show where the Communist Manifesto went wrong, and hopefully provide a better set of ideas, and hopefully have this go as viral as the original one did, and maybe impact the world in the same way, but for the better.
Awesome. Well, I hope that for both of you. Thank you. Thank you so much for checking out this episode of the Coin Stories podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Brunell, and please remember to subscribe to my page and like this video so other people have a chance to see it. Till next time.